Hey everybody, welcome back to the Noggin Notes podcast. My name is Jake Wiskerson. I'm your host, and as always, this show is sponsored by Zephyr Wellness. It's a company I co-own in Northern Nevada, and you can check out more at zephyrwellness.org. We're also sponsored by Audible, and we're blessed enough to be offering our listeners a free 30-day trial if you go to audibletrial.com/nogginnotes and just sign up. You get a free audiobook, and you get to select something from their unmatched selection of content. It not just audiobooks, but it spans entertainment and news and all sorts of things. Go to audibletrial.com/nogginnotes. You get something, we get something, everybody benefits. And of course, Audible is an Amazon company, and so their reach is far and wide. And like I said, their selection is completely unmatched. audibletrial.com/nogginnotes. Support us, support our sponsors. Today's episode is me rambling about various topics that have come to fruition lately in my life in the last week or so, and I think you'll find it enjoyable. I talk a little bit more about the emotional wave as it applies to situations, not just episodes that trigger emotion, but in general, how we can apply that concept in tolerating distress and then teaching others how to do it as well. And we also talk about suicide awareness, because it's always something that we should be aware of and be able to help each other and notice red flags and that kind of thing. So if you want to reach us, info@nogginnotes.com, info@zephyrwellness.org. We look forward to hearing from you. Enjoy the episode. Something occurred to me this week while we were conducting some suicide screenings for children in rural Nevada at the schools out there in Pershing County, which is kind of in the north central part of the state. And what dawned on me was that on this program, we've never actually covered signs of suicide, even though we've talked about it a lot with Walk the Talk America, and we've definitely had some interviews on the subject. I've realized we failed to instruct the listening audience on how to pay attention to that kind of stuff. So I want to spend some time today, and this isn't all that I want to talk about because it's a little bit of a gloomy topic, but it is educational. And I think for those of us in the mental health field, we are pretty well trained on dealing with people who may be experiencing suicidal ideation or who are just, vaguely depressed and maybe, are considering what life would be like, if they weren't here anymore. So that's a little bit of suicidality, but it's on the low end of the scale. So I want to walk through some steps that you can apply practically in your life to know whether people around you, and particularly children, might be experiencing some suicidal thoughts or ideation. And I want to start with children or teens. Now, there's some factors that might increase the risk that a teen or an adolescent might consider suicide. And before I get into this, though, I want to make a language distinction. So, in common parlance, we say committed suicide. Now, in the suicide prevention community, the word "committed" is kind of seen as an epithet. It's a bad word, and it's derogatory because the folks who are really, really involved in the suicide prevention efforts, they make the association with committed to crime. So we want to make sure that we're not talking about suicide as though it's a criminal activity, or that we're branding people as bad or criminal in nature simply because they're considering suicide, or people have died by suicide. They're not criminals. So that's some sort of bailiwick that certain people adhere to. I'm not one to embrace that, because I think commitment has a variety of definitions, including committing oneself to doing something. Which if you're going to kill yourself, that's a heck of a commitment. So I'm not a big stickler on that particular piece of language, but just know that some people are, and they would prefer the phrase "died by suicide" rather than "committed suicide." So as I go in and out of this, I'm gonna use what my brain thinks is most appropriate. So if we're talking about teens or adolescents or even youth, say under the age of 12 or 13, some of the risk factors are obviously depression. If you're facing a depressed state, life doesn't seem quite as bright anymore, and other mental disorders can come alongside that too, and chiefly suicide. And I want to hover here for a second, because suicide is often not frequently attributed to anxiety, and I think if we're thinking of terms of what brings people to take their own lives, anxiety is it's a mercurial subject or a mercurial presentation insofar as you can be worried quite a lot about a lot of things to the point that you worry so much that you quit. And then your worry actually ends up masquerading as depression because you've kind of caught that, screw it, I don't care attitude, which in an untrained setting, or at least a low trained setting, might look, walk, talk, act like depression, but really it takes a little bit more skill to ask some questions about, are you concerned? Are you a perfectionist? Are your grades not where they need to be? Are you concerned about not getting into college? And if the answers to those questions are yes, you start looking a little bit more for anxiety, which is why sometimes when kids present with depression and they're prescribed an antidepressant medication, it actually makes things worse because they're not actually experiencing depression. They're experiencing anxiety that has gotten so overwhelming that they've kind of checked out and their brain is still working on overdrive, worrying and being concerned about the things about which they're anxious. So we want to be very, very careful when we interview teens and children about their quote-unquote depressive symptoms, that we're not overlooking the anxiety that may be giving rise to the depression, facade, and make sure that it's not something else beneath the surface like anxiety. So obviously mental disorders, depression, anxiety, substance abuse for sure can all contribute to increased risk factors for suicide. I think this may be obvious to people like me, but maybe it's not so obvious to the listening community, but the quote-unquote feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. So this can often accompany bullying activities too. So if your kid is, making statements like, oh, I just don't matter anymore, or things just aren't worth it, or I don't really care, sometimes that might just be, general teen angst, and that's fine. But we want to ask questions like, hey, is anybody picking on you at school? What is it about you that makes you feel this way? Why are you believing that you don't matter? Start asking probing questions about that, because if they're and if you listen to this program long enough, you know that hopelessness and worthlessness are not quote unquote feelings; they're beliefs or ideas. But broader society talks like that, like it's a feeling of hopelessness, right? But it's not; it's a belief. But if they believe that they're worthless, or they don't have any hope, or they're not dreaming, or they're just kind of going through the routine and going through the motions, we want to pay attention to that, because there might be some low level suicidality beneath that. Some other risk factors: family history of suicide, and that's not because it's genetic. And I like clap my hands if I'm in a room to help people pay attention. So I'll like clap my hands to bring your attention back to this. It's not in your genes. Suicidality is not genetic, but family history of suicide, what it does is it almost gives a permission, right? So if Uncle Joe has committed suicide and we have this third cousin who also died by suicide, then maybe it looks like a little bit better option for me. Similarly, divorce that runs in families that have had breakups. Divorce is now suddenly on the table as an option for checking out of a relationship, whereas families who have long-standing histories of years-long, decades-long marriages, divorce just tends not to be an option, or it's lesser of an option. So we want to pay attention to family history of suicide. And then also previous suicide attempts too. So if somebody's attempted or talked like it, then they're more likely to execute it fully and go down that path. Physical illness, if there's a chronic physical illness, for sure, that can lead people to wanting self-death. We want to pay attention to access to lethal weapons in the home or lethal means. So any sort of medication that can, if taken in too high of a volume, cause death more quickly than another medication. I'm not talking about lock up your Tylenol, although Tylenol can certainly be problematic. It's not nearly as lethal as, say, an overdose of a benzodiazepine or some of the other prescribed medications. Heart medications for sure can certainly cause death quicker than some others. And then obviously weapons. So if you have firearms in the home, we want to be mindful of where they're stored and where they're locked. Hopefully they're locked. As a firearms advocate myself, I want to make sure that my firearms are locked and away from children so that there's no accidental discharges, or that there's not just simply a temptation of curiosity as well. Children will often pick up a gun, and out of curiosity, the first thing they do is look straight down the barrel and pull the trigger. And if that weapon's loaded, dead child. So we want to make sure that our guns are locked and safely tucked away and in secure places, and with combinations and passwords that they can't easily stumble upon. And then also knowing somebody with suicidal behavior, such as a family member, a friend, or and this is a big one, celebrities. And celebritydom is hugely influential in children. And there was a show called 13 Reasons Why that gained some national attention, and I believe international attention as well, because there was a story of a girl who killed herself and gave all these reasons as to why it was okay. And so this caused I want to be careful not to say cause, because we're not really sure, but there seemed to be a correlation of an increase in suicidal teenagers when that show was released. I believe it was on Netflix or something like that. So we also want to consider sexual orientation as well. So if there's an unsupportive family or a hostile school environment or community that's not supportive, the suicide rate for people in the gay community is much, much higher, and trans folks, transgender people, I think it's like 40% in the trans community. It's really bad. So we want to be mindful of that too. If a child is struggling with his or her sexual orientation or sexual identity or gender identity, we want to be mindful that is often accompanied by an increased risk for suicidality. So those are some risk factors. But now let's talk warning signs. Okay, so warning signs for kids and teens. Obviously, if they're talking about it, that's a big deal. We call that ideation, meaning you have an idea and you're expressing it. So if they're thinking, writing, drawing, talking about it, suicide, death, afterlife, what would life be like if I weren't here? Maybe everybody'd be better off without me. Phrases like that. Now, I want to couch that by saying normal exploration of one's own mortality is absolutely natural, as long as there's no plan. Or we want to scale these things, and I'll get into that in a minute. But if there's no plan and it's just a vague expression or ideation, oftentimes that's just kids being kids, as adults will be adults, and we contemplate things all the time about what if something were to happen, and then what would I do about it, right? So we don't want to necessarily pathologize a normal human exploration of death and dying and the afterlife. We want to sit down and educate our children about that, which means that we ourselves have to be knowledgeable and we have to be comfortable with the topic. And that leads into an emotional wave, and I'll get into that in a minute because I wanted to talk about the emotional wave differently in this podcast. Signs. More signs are dependence on substances, alcohol and drugs. That's a huge one. So if your kid's smoking a lot of pot, pay attention to that, because it's often used to de-anxietize or avoid or escape. If they're drinking, stop that. I mean, you got to intervene. There's just no equivocation about this. Kids should not be doing drugs. I don't care how popular they become in the adult world or how much gets legalized for those over the age of 18 or 21. Children should not be doing them, full stop. And if they are, be aware that something else is lurking beneath the surface. We can chalk up, high school partying to having fun and exploration and socializing and all that stuff. But if it's chronic, and high school partying, by the way, if you're drinking during parties, that's not okay either. That should just never happen. It's illegal. It's unhealthy. There's just no good that can come from it. If you want to party, do it sober and play board games in the living room. But if it's more chronic than just a periodic or episodic party, we really want to pay attention to what else is lurking beneath the surface, because just like in adults who drink or use drugs in far too great of a capacity, chances are really strong that they're just covering up some psychological distress underneath that could lead to suicide. Uh, Trouble focusing or thinking clearly, lack of interest or pleasure in activities that usually were interesting or pleasurable to that person, risk-taking behaviors, recklessness, bizarre behavior, and violence obviously is another one. And then changes in eating or sleep